and welcome to week 16 on 14th century art in Europe, the chapter that ends our semester. A number of conflicts, secular and religious, had beset Western Europe during the late Middle Ages. These included the Black Death, which you can see a graphic of on your screen, famine, the Hundred Years' War, and the Great Schism, which is sometimes called the Western Schism of the Catholic Church. During the Western Schism, two individuals claimed to be the rightful successor to the throne. This resulted in a French papacy in Avignon, France, and a Roman one at the Vatican. The major social stratification system in the Middle Ages was feudal, as you know. In this reciprocal system, the vast majority of individuals are peasants who work the land out of debt to the lord and can gain no wealth for their own families. We've discussed feudalism before, but you can read more about it at the link provided in the lecture. The Great Schism of the Catholic Church wounded the legitimacy of the system, as the office of the Pope was no longer considered by some to be absolute in its power and infallibility. Also in the late Middle Ages, we saw that increased urbanization of the major countries of Europe meant a different lifestyle, but not necessarily a better one, for those who could make it to the cities. Late medieval cities might contain a university, along with active artistic guilds, merchants, and cathedrals. It's in the growing urban centers like Florence in Italy and Paris in France that art was often commissioned and purchased. In Italy in the 14th century, the guild system, which had been gaining momentum since the 12th century, became a major economic and social force. The guilds were organizations much like unions as we think of them today. Professional artists and other artisans would normally belong to a guild that represented his or her particular art form. These guilds controlled pricing of their work, as well as provided strict quality control within their professions. Another function of the guild was to protect trade secrets through the strict vows taken by its members. The guilds also benefited artists and artisans in a number of ways. Guilds provided a sort of insurance policy in the event a member was ill and unable to work. As unions do today, the guilds also provided representation of the individual within a more powerful group. This allowed guild members to work together to protest high taxes or other impositions on individuals by very powerful local feudal governments. If an artist wanted to join the guild, usually he, and sometimes she, would start as an apprentice and move up to journeyman before becoming a full guild member. In Florence, Italy, as elsewhere, women were allowed entry into the guilds only rarely, as far as we can tell. It is difficult to know for sure. In instances where we know through other public records that a woman belonged to a guild, her name does not appear in the official records or rolls of the guild. It is assumed that, most of the time, female guild members had taken over membership from a deceased husband, since this is how women gained membership to the guilds in the few instances for which we have records. This does not, of course, mean that women did not regularly participate in the creation of art forms or in other professional activities. Their participation, however, was downplayed or downright ignored in society during their own lifetimes and later in official records and histories. You may or may not have noticed by now in your academic career that there is a tendency of history to ignore the achievements or realities of women in general. This is a problem that as contemporary history students will have to work hard to circumvent in our quest to get closer to the truth about how art was made and used. Guilds were also benevolent organizations that were expected to provide services to the less fortunate in the community. Like most entities that existed in 14th century Italy, the guilds were connected to the Catholic Church. In Italy, as in most places in Europe, there was no freedom of or from religion. Due to the proximity of the center of the Catholic Church in Rome, this is especially true for Italian professionals. Or San Michele in Florence is a structure that served many purposes in the 14th century. It was a granary, a market, a purportedly miraculous shrine to the Virgin Mary, and a major guild house. As your textbook author points out, San Michele is characteristic of the intertwining nature of society in the Middle Ages. As a typical medieval center, it is also a great example of how important the arts were to society. Later in the early Renaissance, where Art 282 picks up, San Michele would be the location of an enormous public art project. Each guild hired an artist to sculpt a saint or other religious subject to adorn the building's exterior. You can actually see if I can see some photos for you. There we go. There is a photo of the exterior of Or San Michele, and so you can see some of those sculptures. In art of the Middle Ages, most art historians agree, the focus was on the ethereal plane of the afterlife. Art forms like painting and sculpture were intended to help worshippers achieve communion with a Catholic or Orthodox Christian deity. As such, they were often created in a relatively unrealistic, somewhat abstract way. Instead of realistic three-dimensional images of people, popular during the earlier Roman Empire, artists of the Middle Ages used elongation and abstraction of the figure along with gold leaf and other devices to achieve the feeling of an otherworldly realm. This is also true for architecture. By the Gothic era, architects sought to transform masonry to the light of heaven through the use of high ceilings and stained glass. This focus on the afterlife was slowly shifting during the late Gothic era, especially in Italy. Italian artisans, artists, poets, and scholars encouraged the focus on society and the human plight. In general, there was a shift in focus away from the otherworldly concern of the Middle Ages and toward life on earth. This progression from 13th century scholasticism, which drew upon reason as well as faith, is known as humanism, defined by Stockstad as a worldview that focused on human beings. You can read about the humanistic shift in literature and a new spirit in 14th century literature in your book. In the visual arts, humanism first took hold in architecture and frescoes, paintings that combine plaster and paint. Fresco was an ancient art form that'll gain popularity again in the early Renaissance of the 15th century, and more about fresco painting will appear soon. The architectural work on the screen, the Palazzo Signoria, or Palazzo Vecchio as it's also known, which means Palace of the Elders or Old Palace, is an excellent example of this shift toward humanism. The Palazzo was the governing house of the city of Florence. With its crenellated roof, tower, and high walls, it is fortified, but it is quite accessible compared to palaces of the earlier Middle Ages. This defensive architecture is understandable, given the contentious nature of central Italy. However, when we look closely at its position, we see it is in the center of everyday life in Florence. The palazzo sits on a piazza, which means plaza, in which crowds can gather, and it is accompanied to its west by a loggia, or covered porch, which provides shelter. Placing the government at the center of town, instead of behind walls on a high hill, made it not only more accessible, but also more accountable to the public. It is relatively subtle shifts like these that signal the onset of a humanistic attitude in the public life of the late Middle Ages. However, in the important art form known as panel painting, the older medieval Gothic style remained prevalent. Altarpieces were fundamentally important components of Catholic worship in the Middle Ages. Paintings by Bernardo Dotti, which we just saw, by Duccio di Buoninsegna, and Cimabue. You can see Cimabue's work. Duccio and Cimabue here. Right. These were often part of multi-paneled or polyptych altarpieces for cathedrals and private chapels. So you can see in this illustration here that imagines the front of the Maestà altarpiece with all of its missing paintings kind of put together digitally. Most often, these were painted in tempera on panel. As we know, interest in the Virgin Mary grew immensely during the Middle Ages. The image of the Virgin Mary with Christ child became very popular during this time. It's believed that this is at least partly due to the popularity of mother goddess images in the pre-Christian visual vernacular of Europe. For whatever reason, the Virgin Mary was especially revered as an intercessor who could act on the behalf of the faithful. This was true throughout the Christian world. In the Western Catholic Church, centered in Italy, and also in the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church in Constantinople, Turkey. Images of the Virgin Mary in Western European panel paintings resembled icons of the Eastern Orthodox Church well into the more humanistic Renaissance era. You can compare an Italian work on the left with the Byzantine work on the right. For that reason, we often call the style of works by Cimabue and Duccio Italo-Byzantine. In the works of Cimabue and Duccio, we can see a treatment of the space that is highly and deliberately unrealistic and ethereal, where the sky is golden and three-dimensional space as we know it ceases to exist. The treatment of figures is similar. They are relatively schematic in their physiques, and their faces are typed, meaning the same template is used over and over again instead of creating individual portraits of, say, these angels or these angels. Again, this all intends to transport the viewer to another world, a mystical place. The composition often used by Duccio, Cimabue, and also Giotto, as we're going to see, is known as a maestà, which means majesty. The Virgin Mary and Christ child are in majesty, shown celebrated as a king and queen on the throne of heaven. In the Middle Ages, the maestà image is often combined in altarpieces with images of the stories of the life of the Virgin and Christ in smaller panels, such as the predella panels down here that include the Nativity. Giotto's work of the early 1300s included panel paintings such as his Maestà, which many perceive as a more realistic three-dimensional depiction of a woman and child in space than the other examples we've seen. His architectonic throne was especially admired by later early Renaissance artists. However, it is his work in fresco that kept his name alive in the later humanistic era of the early Renaissance.